Hello, everybody. This is Principles of Macroeconomics, and I am Liam Malloy, and we're here at the University of Rhode Island, and we're going to continue with Chapter 16 of the first edition of Core's the Economy, at least until they publish Chapters 9 and 10 of the second edition. So Chapter 16 is about the important question of whether new technology destroys jobs. And there's really two answers, because the obvious answer is that yes, technology does destroy jobs. New technology allows us to do more things with fewer people, meaning that we need fewer people doing jobs that they were doing before. The sort of more full and complex answer is that so far in human history, new technology has created more jobs than it has destroyed, so that even while jobs are getting destroyed by new technology, we are, creating more and more jobs. The unemployment rate does not go up and up and up as we create new technology. Now, this is obviously an important question now, as always. Right now, we have the development of artificial intelligence, and there's a big question, and in some areas, a belief that this is going to destroy a lot of jobs. And so then the question is, all right, well, does that mean that we're just going to do different things? Does it mean we're going to have a lot of people who are unemployed? And so that's the question we're going to start answering in Chapter 16. Okay, so let's get started here. One sort of, I think, important thing to remember is that economic growth is all about getting more output with fewer inputs. And that's been true throughout human history, but especially since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen innovation at a faster and faster pace that has allowed us to get rid of jobs that we can do either with more capital or just better technology. And then the question is, all right, well, what do people do then, right? Because people are then going to have to find a new way to make a living. And so far, human beings have always been able to find new productive things to do in the economy. That's not so much true for like horses, right? Horses used to have lots and lots of jobs in the sort of pre-industrial world. And once we had the internal combustion engine and we invented cars and trains and trucks and tractors, we needed fewer and fewer horses. And so there are a lot fewer horses now than there used to be. But of course, there are even more humans now than there used to be, and the unemployment rate is not actually any higher. So we've actually created more and more jobs over time for the human beings to do. So let's just start looking at a little bit of data. So this looks at a bunch of measures of growth, but also the unemployment rate by decade. So you can see this top line here is the unemployment rate. You can see it was a little over 5% in 1955 to 1964, under 5% in the next 10 years, but then increased in the 70s, the mid 70s and early 80s, before decreasing again, obviously increased during the financial crisis, and then decreased again in the 2015 to 2022 timeframe. Growth, so we can measure growth in a lot of different ways, but TFP is total factor productivity, so that's one way to measure growth. You can see it was highest in the 50s, and you can see it was sort of lowest when the unemployment rate is highest, and that's going to be sort of the theme in this chapter, is that when technological growth is fastest, we actually see lower unemployment rates than when technological growth is slower. And I think you can think about this with the idea that when total factor productivity or labor productivity, which is another measure we have here in the dark blue, is higher, then that means that workers are able to produce more. They're more valuable, and so firms are going to hire more of them. And so that's generally what we see. We say that real median family income growth was highest, in those first 2 decades, and then high again in the 2015 to 2022 timeframe, where again we had pretty good growth and productivity. So that's what we're going to look at in this chapter. I think throughout sort of the Industrial Revolution, there has been worry by labor that new technology is going to replace their jobs. And it's not an irrational worry, right? As I said, new technology does replace jobs. New technology makes jobs either, you need fewer jobs to do the same amount of work, and so some jobs get destroyed, or new technology and capital can completely replace labor so that those jobs no longer exist. And that can be very worrying, especially if you've been doing the same job for 20 or 30 years and you feel like you're about to get replaced. And so that microeconomic worry is definitely rational. From a macroeconomic perspective, then the question is, well, do all those jobs getting destroyed in a micro fashion result in higher unemployment, lower growth, etc.? And so far what we've seen is that that's not true. And so we'll look a little bit across countries and see differences between these countries, and we'll talk about sort of different institutions and policies that might explain those differences and what we might want to focus on if we are worried about something like artificial intelligence destroying a lot of jobs. So one thing, that we can see, so these are lots of different countries here, and this is the unemployment rate over time going back to the 60s, and you can see there's been very different outcomes. And so there's might be sort of a general pattern where we have somewhat higher unemployment rates in the 70s and 80s, somewhat lower unemployment rates in the 90s and early 2000s, and then obviously increasing unemployment rates after the financial crisis. But they're pretty different, right? Here we have, Norway at, something less than 4% unemployment rate, and Spain over 23% unemployment rate here. We can see Spain has sort of had higher unemployment rates since the, late 70s, whereas other countries have had pretty low unemployment rates. And so that's one of the things that we're going to talk about, because obviously in a world of technological innovation, we'd like to be a country that can have both fast growth in output and in wages, but also low unemployment. And so here, I think we've seen this graph before in this course. Here we have the average unemployment rates from a long time period, so 1970 to 2011, and then real wage growth along that same time frame. And you can see if you sort of take out those lines, there's not really any clear relationship between these two. But what we can see is that some countries like Norway and Japan have had fairly high real wage growth over that time period and fairly low unemployment rates. Other countries have had sort of middling relationships there. And then some countries have had higher unemployment rates and lower real wage growth. The United States is in that sort of low performers category, although I will say, we start, because the United States tends to start at a high level, growth tends to be a little bit lower than other countries who are catching up over that time period. So the question is, all right, well, how can we be more like Norway and Japan and less like Spain and Italy and maybe Belgium? So we want to sort of go back and just remind ourselves of sort of the microeconomic incentives for innovation, right? And we, if you go back to your microeconomics course, or, you go look at some of my videos from my microeconomics course, the idea is that firms can earn extra profits, which we call innovation rents, by introducing new technology. Because remember what new technology does sort of by definition in economics. It's that we're able to either produce more with the same number of inputs, or we can produce the same amount with fewer inputs. Of course, we could also say we can produce, like a higher quality with the same amount of inputs that we're then able to sell at a higher price. But either way, that results in higher profits. And the idea, which we've talked about before, that firms that, introduce these new innovations then put pressure on other firms. And if other firms can't adapt and keep up with those innovations, then they are the ones that are going to go out of business. And we call this creative destruction, right? The creative side is the new innovation, and the destruction side is those companies going out of business. And so, the way we sort of model this is with increasing levels of capital and technology. And often these things are complementary, right? So new technology often requires that firms invest in new machines, new computers, new robots, new factories even, in order to produce more. And so if we sort of think about how this happens, and the importance of it, right, is that allows every worker that is working to produce more, and that allows for an increase in our average living standards. And so we can think about this just in terms of our standard production function, where we have capital per worker on our horizontal axis and output per worker on our vertical axis. And our production function is concave, right? That tells us that we have a decreasing return to capital. And an increase in technology is a shift up in our production function, right? And so, if we were at B and we shift up our production function, then we might end up at C. And so now we have more capital per worker and more output per worker at, the same marginal or average, capital per worker. So we can kind of see this in a little bit more detail here, right? So just remember that our marginal capital per worker is the slope of the production function, and the average output per worker is the slope of the ray from the origin to each point. So since the same line goes through points B and C, they have the same average product of worker. And so obviously each firm is going to decide how much capital and technology to invest in order to increase their profits. So if we think about looking at the data, right, that's obviously just a model, but the data we can sort of look at, the problem with technology, right, in general, is that we can't really measure technology very well. What we end up doing is we measure how much, capital per worker there is, how much human capital, so education and skills and experience there is, how many workers there are, and we sort of think about how much each of those contributes to growth, and then whatever is left over, we call that technology. So we can't really see technology directly in the data, but what we can see is, that countries have been increasing their capital per worker, which has also increased the output or GDP per worker. And so, you look at a country like the United States, it's increased their output and capital per worker quite substantially since the late 19th century, and other countries have as well. You could sort of see these as potentially different levels of technology per worker, right? If two countries have the same capital per worker, but one country is producing more, then that is basically by definition that country has more technology. Now, the question then is, all right, well, are we creating more jobs than we are destroying, or vice versa? And so this looks at that sort of over decades for a bunch of different countries. And the red line is how many jobs get destroyed. The blue line is how many jobs get created. And then the gray bar is just the difference between the two. And you can see that for all of these countries, except for the UK in this case, we've created more jobs than we've destroyed. And that's been the general pattern throughout history, that yes, creative destruction does creates some, does have some job destruction, right? But it creates more jobs, and therefore the net result is that we have more jobs over time than we did before. We can look at this in the United States a little bit more closely. So what you can see is that this goes from 2000 to 2010, and so we have this sort of expansion time where job creation is mostly higher than job destruction. And then what happens during recessions is that that flips. And so both in the smaller recession of 2001, but also in the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, job destruction becomes much higher than job creation. And that generally tends to be because firms don't need to produce as much. And so it's more demand driven than supply driven. But in good times, usually we are creating more jobs than we're destroying. You can see this in this graph, which comes from Calculated Risk blog, where we have the number of job openings in the black line, but then we have the number of hires in the blue line, and then the stacked bars are the number of quits in light blue, and then the number of layoffs or discharges in red. And so the sum of that is how many people are leaving their job, either voluntarily or involuntarily. And so long as the blue line is above that stacked bar, we're creating more jobs than we destroy. But there are times, like during the Great Recession or the earlier recession in 2001, and of course during the pandemic, where more people lose their jobs than get hired. And so what this is saying is that during good times, when the economy is doing well, we're generally creating more jobs than we're destroying. And so we would like to keep that going as much as we can. And so finally, just this sort of last graph, this is for the United States by decade going back to the late 19th century. And on our horizontal axis, we have the average unemployment rate by decade. And on the vertical axis, we have our average annual labor productivity growth. And what you can see is that the decades that had really high productivity growth also had really low unemployment. And decades that had higher unemployment tended to have lower productivity growth. And then, of course, we have a couple outliers. We have the Great Depression from the 1930s, which we'll talk about in Chapter 17. And then the 1890s was actually called the Long Depression. And we had very high unemployment in that decade as well. So we'll stop there, and what we're going to do in the next few chapters is we'll think about sort of the relationship between firms hiring and the unemployment rate. And then we'll also sort of think about the differences between countries as we've already started to look at in this video.